Well, thank you to Alicia Wagner Calzada for joining us to talk about her work as both a journalist and an attorney for journalists. Alicia could tell you more about her professional background. She's in San Antonio, Texas, where she both practices law and private practice, and also works as a legal counsel with the National Press Photographers Association, the NPPA, which is a wonderful organization that if you're interested in or practicing photojournalism, you should think about joining. They do amazing advocacy work for the rights of news photographers, and I'll let her tell you a little bit more about it. But thanks for joining us for a conversation about the rights of photojournalists and videographers.
Thanks, Frank. It's a pleasure to talk to you about this stuff. For your students, I mean, I've been exactly where they are, a journalism student pursuing a life of visual journalism. And, actually early on when I was a teenager, people who knew I was, shall we say, combativo, would say, you should be a lawyer. You should be like, I never want to be a lawyer. But after about 15 years as a visual journalist, started advocating for my profession and for my colleagues through the NPPA, through my leadership in the NPPA, served as president and served on the board and started our advocacy committee. And just kind of the path led me to become a lawyer, because I decided that, the work that needed to be done was both meaningful to me and, significant, and that it was worth kind of making that transition, which is no small transition, but now I do serve as one of NPPA's 2 attorneys, in addition to having a practice of my own. And I have some journalism clients like small newspapers, on online publication, photographers, individual photographers, a blogger that I represent in a defamation suit, and things like that. I did work for a big law firm for about 5 years and before I opened my own practice. And so, but now I'm just running and gunning and mostly focused on serving the rights of visual journalists. We do copyright advocacy. So we work with national legislation that relates to protecting the rights of photographers and their copyrights and creators. Really, we support all creators, but our focus is, of course, on visual. And then, of course, the First Amendment side, in ensuring the right to record, the right to take pictures, and fighting back against, typically state and local regulations and legislation that tries to interfere with the right to do your journalism work. So, we have a lawsuit right now in the state of Texas challenging their drone laws, which is really exciting. And that's moving along. We have a lawsuit over, believe it or not, a labor law in California that has impacted the ability of journalists there to do their work freely. And so we just generally target anything we say. Usually, if we talk to the legislators who are considering laws, we can help them kind of tailor their laws so that they're not so harmful for journalists. But lately, it seems like we've had a few occasions to do things the hard way, shall we say.
Yeah, so that's actually a perfect segue to talk about kind of that bundle of privacy issues that sometimes arise in collision with the right to gather news and information. And whether it is paparazzi laws, drone laws, the so-called ag-gag laws about photographing agricultural operations. I know NPPA has taken a lead in asserting the rights of photojournalists and videographers in all of those situations where there's maybe overzealous attempts to regulate their activity. Can you kind of talk a little bit about the overlay of privacy law and photojournalism? There are a lot of misconceptions out there about what is and is not private, and people sometimes get very assertive about saying that my photo is my own business and I should be able to control how it's used. I should be able to veto whether you can photograph me or publish my photo. What does the law say about that?
Sure. I mean, the law is pretty basic. If something is in public, it's not private. The right to privacy protects things that are private, and that includes both information. For example, if you were suing somebody over an invasion of privacy or publication of private facts, but then you put those facts on Facebook, they're not private. And so you can think of the streets in a similar way, streets, sidewalks, public facilities, public buildings. If you're out in public, you're not keeping something private, and that includes yourself. So, I think that people do conflate the idea of privacy and, what they might not want people to see. But, your right to privacy within your home is pretty fierce. And you do leave that right at home when you go out into public. Now there's, we've talked about the ethical issues, which is a different question. But that's a general, if you're on a sidewalk, a public street, that kind of thing, public park, these are all things that journalists should feel secure that, they can take pictures there.
And I mentioned really quickly that bundle of legislative issues on which NPPA has had to engage, and sometimes to include going to court under the First Amendment, under things like the Ag laws, which the challenges have been generally successful. The idea that a legislature could dictate that certain things are off limits to being photographed has not fared very well in the courts when it's challenged under the First Amendment. I guess, could you briefly talk about some of, I mentioned paparazzi laws, ag laws, drone laws. All of those seem to be kind of problems that are surfacing more and more as legislators try to dictate what people can and can't publish.
Yeah, and I have always said that drone laws are really ag laws in disguise, because the people who are driving a lot of the drone legislation are not people who are not, homeowners who are afraid, even though the lawmaker might say, like, wow, if we don't do this, people are going to be hovering in our windows and peeking through, at my children and stuff like that. The driving force, the people who pick up the phone and call the lawmaker who they've donated to, are big ag, big oil groups like that. So that's really the source of a lot of these laws. We were successful. The most recent lawsuit, the ag law that we were successful was in Wyoming. That law made it illegal to collect data, but it included being on public land. The initial version included being on public land and collecting data, which included taking pictures of certain things, even when you were just standing on public property. And then one of the thorny issues that related to that in Wyoming is there is a lot of sort of public land that is only accessible by crossing private land. And so there was a lot of mixing up of those two issues in the legislation, and attempts to try to use private land as a way to restrict people from documenting public land. And so, that was a big fight. We were successful. We're very proud of that. In Texas, what happened was they passed, and I testified against this law. It was now 7.5 years ago. I know because I was about to have my first kid, and they made me stay up till 4 a.m. to testify. And I was sitting there like a big balloon. But the law is really unusual in that it makes it illegal to document private property or persons on private property without their permission using a drone or UAV or UAS. So that is regardless of where you are and where the drone is in terms of airspace. And so you could be with a drone, on a sidewalk, or like sitting outside a 13-story window. I can hang out the window and take pictures of the scene in front of me, which involves quite a bit of private property. And that's of course legal. But if I stood on the sidewalk and lifted my drone up to that same space, that's illegal under the law. And there's a few things in there, like the definition of surveillance is not in the statute. So you have to look at the dictionary, and the word surveillance is very broadly defined to include basic journalism. And so that's why we believe that it applies to journalists, and we're very concerned about the impact. And it's had a very real world impact on the journalists in Texas who would otherwise be using drones for their journalistic purposes, and are both, in some cases, being chilled from doing so. In other cases, if they're doing it, being threatened with arrest and having other concerns, even though they're going forward. And so we just won the state had filed a motion to dismiss on our lawsuit, and the judge denied it for the most part. There was a preemption argument, which relates to sort of the FAA's exclusive jurisdiction over drones. And the court said that that did not apply to the specific areas that we were challenging the law, but the entire challenge to the law is going forward under First Amendment grounds.
Yeah, just to draw a very bright line underneath that for educational purposes, right? Legislatures, city councils, county commissions, Congress, they can pass any restriction they want to pass, but it still has to satisfy the First Amendment and other constitutional standards, or else ultimately it's unenforceable and it can be voided. And so while you often hear people say, well, I know what the First Amendment says, but we follow our own rules here. We follow our own regulations. We follow the phrase, I know what the First Amendment says, has a period at the end and not a comma at the end. That is the end of that conversation. Once a regulation or a statute is contrary to the First Amendment, then ultimately it's void. And it may take, as in your situation, many years to litigate that successfully, but ultimately you cannot pass something that gives people fewer rights than the Constitution guarantees. And that's just kind of a civic 101 point that a lot of legislatures have missed out on.
Well, they haven't just missed out on it. They willfully ignore it. I mean, I advocate on all kinds of First Amendment. Whenever I see a bill that touches the First Amendment, I think about whether we need to advocate on it. And I've been in meetings with lawmakers where they've said straight up, like, it's not my problem if it violates the First Amendment. So take for that what you will. But the other point I would make is that, the First Amendment is a baseline, and a lot of states actually have stronger First Amendment protections or free speech protections than the First Amendment. And so even if something passed constitutional muster under the US Constitution, it may still be unconstitutional under a state constitution. And so that's another factor that needs to be weighed when states are doing these things.
Yeah, great point. So I want to talk a little bit about specifically the subset of issues that arise when photojournalists and videographers are interacting with law enforcement. I know this is something that NPPA gets involved in a lot. Reporters, photographers, videographers will have their equipment confiscated, sometimes even be arrested because they get too close to the action when police are doing their work out in the field. What does the law have to say about what a journalist can and can't do at a crime scene or a protest or some other heavily policed area like that?
Yeah, so I mean, you're very safe if you stick to public places like sidewalks and public streets. Some jurisdictions, some police departments will put up, will issue credentials or may allow a journalist to cross a yellow tape. You shouldn't plan on crossing the police line without permission. But one of the things that I think a lot of people get confused about, including police officers and journalists, is, the police might set up a staging area for journalists. That's nice for those that want to be in it. But as a journalist, you're not required to sit in a staging area. And this is particularly important for photographers. If you see other people standing around, you have a right to be exactly where they are. So the police can't say, well, the neighbors can hang out on the sidewalk in front of the house, but the journalists have to be half a mile down the street. They may try to say that, but that's not something that will fly. And that's something that we have certainly seen thoroughly rejected and repudiated by courts. There was a situation in Long Island where, this was a few years ago, a TV photographer was just, shooting some sort of police incident. And for some reason, the police officer was just really in a bad mood and had a thing, but he was, the video showed, and one thing I would encourage journalists to do, roll, keep rolling. You've got that video camera in your pocket, it's your iPhone, turn it on and roll with it, because what the footage, and this guy was a video journalist, so he was rolling anyway, but what his footage showed was that there were people everywhere, but for some reason, the police officer wanted him to go far, far away and literally knocked him down and pinned him down and arrested him for not moving, even though the footage showed all kinds of other people just standing around watching. And so that's a really important thing, I think, for journalists to remember when they're out in the field, is that, if the local police want to create some sort of, area that is useful to you and helpful to you, that's fine, but they don't get to dictate where the media can be, beyond their ability, their need to clear the area for safety reasons from all other people.
Yeah, one other thing that I always like to try to remind people of, because honestly, it's kind of an obscure law and it doesn't get used very much, but boy, when it does, it's powerful stuff, is the Federal Privacy Protection Act. That's a great statute because it's one of the very few times that journalists get any enhanced protection above and beyond what Joe Citizen gets. The Privacy Protection Act specifically says that the police can't search a place where journalists store their unpublished work or seize it without going in front of a judge and getting an order where the journalist gets to be represented in case there's a privilege issue or some other reason why the journalist shouldn't have to comply. And so that's one of those doctrines that departs from the normal rule that journalists don't get any superior rights to members of the general public. If it's Joe Witness probably has to comply with the police, but Joe Journalist doesn't necessarily have to comply, at least not without a hearing. And so that's one of those tools that just isn't known about very much and the general public doesn't talk about it, but boy, it's powerful stuff.
That's a really important point that you mentioned. And one of the reasons it's important is because we don't have a federal shield law, generally speaking. That's the closest we have. And a lot of states do have really powerful shield laws. And so, but and you don't want to be in a position where federal law is being used because state law is unavailable to try to obtain your outtakes or your materials or your notes or those kinds of things. And it's really important in terms of the question of what would happen if you were subpoenaed, or what would happen if somebody tried to get access to your work product. It's important to have those conversations up front. Figure out what they are, whether it's with a freelance client or with a, if you're on staff, you need to know what your publication will do, what your publication's policies are, so that, when that moment comes, and it doesn't come for everybody, right? But it's really not a normal experience for the thousands and thousands of journalists in America, but if it does happen and you want to know exactly what your plan is and what your strategy, it's kind of like when you get on an airplane, they say, plane's not going to crash, but,
locate the exits just in case. The time to locate them is not when smoke starts pouring out. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, it's a lot more common than a plane crash, but, because it does happen and we've seen it happen a lot this year, but you should absolutely be prepared for what you do and have those conversations in advance.
So we've been talking about the law so far, but I also want to talk a little bit about professional ethics and practices, because as I try to tell people all the time, the law is very forgiving. It gives you lots of latitude to take all the photos and shoot all the video that you want, but then you may make an editorial judgment that you're not going to use everything that you gather. And so your legal rights may point you in one direction, but your best ethical and professional judgment may ultimately point you in a different direction. And so those two things are not exactly the equivalent to each other. NPPA is kind of known as being the guardian of ethics for that profession, and they have a code of ethics that's widely circulated and used among the field. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the types of ethical judgment calls that your clients would find themselves having to make, or maybe that you've had to make yourself?
Yeah, sure. Let me pull it up just so I can share it with you guys. So
Perfect.
So our code of ethics, we have a preamble, but there's some pretty basic bullet points. And I'll add that there's two ways that ethics evolves. One is when technology changes. So, we had a code of ethics that was probably close to as old as the organization we started in 1946. And, it did not really address technology in terms of, starting in the late 80s and 90s, you could start to do things on the computer to your images that you could never do in the darkroom. And now, of course, the level of ways that you can impact your images digitally is really extreme. So I think about 15, maybe 20 years ago, the code of ethics was updated to be a little more modern, shall we say, but it was still designed to be technology neutral. So in those intervening years, things like drones have come up, but if you read the code of ethics, you'll see that it's technology neutral. So it really doesn't matter if you're talking about standing on the sidewalk with your film camera or live feed drone footage,
Right.
So some of the things that I want to highlight here that really are important, and are part of an evolution that we're seeing in conversations that we're seeing in terms of ethics, and just the way people view their personal ethics as a journalist. Treat all subjects with dignity and respect, consideration to vulnerable subjects, and compassion to victims of crime or tragedy. There's a thing, if you look here, I think if I highlight this, you can see it, yeah.
Yes.
So again, legally, you absolutely have a right to stand in a public place and photograph moments of grief. But as a journalist who is practicing ethics, you do want to make sure that you're not just showing things that are going to bring people personal misery, just for the sake of having the shot. And so I think this is a really useful ethical principle when you just think about the impact that it's going to have. But, the public, sometimes our job is to report on something really important that's happening. And so I think that a lot of people can look to that. And, another thing is, this is the NPPA Code of Ethics. Most publications have some version of a code of ethics, or they've adopted or decided to adopt NPPA Code of Ethics. SPJ has a Code of Ethics. And, but people can also have their own personal code of ethics that, that they decide to live by, and it's based on whatever they think is acceptable and what they're willing to do. But remember that you do have to be a journalist, and you do have to tell these hard stories. If you are not willing to tell hard stories, you have to think about the beat that you ultimately are on.
Yeah.
And if you can't tell hard stories with dignity, then you need to find a beat where that's not important. Or you need to find a career in photography where that's not important.
Well, you mentioned too, and I see that this is addressed several places, you don't manipulate the images in a way that is going to mislead people. And we know that not only now with Photoshop tools, it's eminently possible to do that, but on social media, people are accustomed to kind of tuning up their photos using editing tools and screens and filters of various kinds, which can be deceptive in intentional or maybe unintentional ways. You could be depicting a scene and it took place in a darkened area and you brighten up the area. And that is a different story then. It's telling a different story because the area looks brighter than it really was. That's a potentially harmless sounding thing to do that might actually wind up in a journalism context changing the direction of the storytelling. And I'm sure there are lots of other examples like that.
Yeah, it's you know, and when I say like ethics evolves, I really mean it. Like 30, 40 years ago, you would see photographs and in the darkroom, people would, we called it the hand of God because you can put your hand under the enlarger light and, you know, burn something and you can dodge and you could really make these dramatic, and it was all considered okay. You know, nowadays, that kind of stuff would not fly and in most newspapers. And in fact, people have been fired for doing the equivalent kind of thing to their photographs, like completely, you know, using Photoshop to completely burn out a background in a news photograph. You know, now there's some photographs that are of a more artistic nature where that stuff is more acceptable. It's important to communicate with the public through your captions or the way you label the photograph when that kind of stuff happens. But yeah, I mean, right now, typically what I see is, you know, maybe a little bit of, you know, certainly cleaning up dust on your, you know, sometimes people get dust in the sensor, in the film sensor, and, you know, there's no problem with cleaning that kind of stuff up, but cleaning up the background because you have power lines in the background and just, you know, wiping them out, completely unacceptable. You know, taking things out that aren't truly in the photograph or were in front of your eyes when you took the picture would never be acceptable. Adding things in, I mean, if people do all kinds, I mean, you know, people get caught doing just things that kind of blow your mind if you've lived and breathed this for so many years. But you know, all of that kind of stuff is considered unacceptable. So it's really, you know, you can tone a photograph a little bit, you know, brighten it, darken it as a whole to make it the way that it was, the way that it showed up. But, you know, drastic changes would really be severely frowned on, shall we say.
Right, and the ethics code says don't alter it in a way that can mislead or misrepresent. So your example of taking specks of dust out is not misleading or misrepresenting, but you wouldn't crop somebody out of an image who was really there if that person's presence at the event was somehow important to the story, right? So that's an example of something that could mislead or misrepresent.
Yeah, it wouldn't matter whether they were important or not. You would never ever remove someone from a photograph or put someone in to a news photograph. The only reason you would do that is if you were looking for an exit ticket from your job.
Well, if you can stop sharing that, I want to ask one last question by the way of wrap up, and it's kind of a biggie, which is we've talked about rights a lot, but there are boundaries that you can't cross as a journalist. And can you talk a little bit about, I guess, ways that people can get themselves into trouble, legally speaking? We talked about how you can get yourself fired, but are there legal cautions and red lines that people need to observe? What are some of those boundaries and constraints that people in the profession should be mindful of?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you know, journalists are protected in a lot of ways, but in many, many ways, and this is almost by design. Okay, we have, other than the, the example you mentioned earlier about the Federal Privacy Act, journalists have rights that are coextensive with the general public, and for the most part, being a journalist is not a ticket to do anything that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do. So you cannot trespass just because you're a journalist. That's a big one. I think people are confused about. And in fact, there have been a few cases that address the question of police officers allowing journalists onto private property when it serves the interests of the police. And those lawsuits and challenges were generally directed at the police. But the police don't necessarily have a right to let you onto private property either. Just because they're police doesn't mean they, have some sort of special power to change the law or the legal relationship between you and a third person. So you have to remember that even if you have a good relationship with law enforcement or fire department or whoever, that is a relationship that controls how you deal with them. They do not control your relationship with other people. And so you do have to be wary of things like trespass and other invasion of privacy issues.
Right. Right. Yeah. In fact, just to interject one sec, right? That's arisen in the context of things like ride-alongs before. The police get a battering ram, they crash through somebody's door, you have your TV camera on your shoulder and you come following right after them. And it turns out the police had no legal basis to enter that home. You may now be responsible to that homeowner and that resident for invasion of privacy, even though you thought you had the police's permission to be there. That's a very concrete example of what you're talking about.
Exactly. And I mean, even if the police, even if the warrant is good, the question of whether you belong in on someone else's private property is, again, not necessarily dictated by them. I remember when I was, I think I was an intern, and there was a spate of fires, and I got this really awesome photo of a firefighter on a roof, and just like shouting instructions and the fires behind him. It was a beautiful photo, but I remember when I read some of those cases in law school, thinking about that picture, because the firefighters let me, go into the backyard to get those pictures, and it was just the backyard, so it wasn't that big of a deal. But in retrospect,
Technically, that could have been a trespass. Technically,
they probably shouldn't have done that. They didn't necessarily have the right.
yeah. Anything else in addition to the physical invasion of other people's private property?
Well, the ethical responsibility and when you publish stuff, you have different issues. So there's the capturing of the image, and then there's the publishing of the image. There's sort of two different areas of the law. And this is a whole nother conversation, but particularly for the folks who are not going into photography, but are going into, writing and editing and copy editing and those kinds of things. I have seen more people who do not understand copyright and what they have a right to publish cause problems for their publication. And it's really important to remember, your responsibilities to comply with copyright law. And that applies to photographers too, in the sense that they may be an employee. And if you're an employee, you don't own the copyright to your work. And so you have to think about what you're going to do with that work beyond just, hand it over to your employer in the process of your job. The other thing to think about in terms of publication and the legal issues surrounding publishing your images is photographs do need to be treated with care with respect to things like defamation and other legal issues, you know, and again, this goes to both the editing side and the writing side and the photography side. But, you know, often for photographers, you turn in your work and you don't have that much control over what happens to it afterwards. Certainly when you're freelancing, you need to make sure that you have contractual agreements that protect you for the things that you don't have control over and the things that your clients might do. But also in the context of the newsroom, really got to be careful about things like headline placement versus photograph, and using stock photos to illustrate a story that might be negative, or imply something negative about what's in the stock photo. I mean, I've seen some things that, you know, would keep me up at night if I was responsible for the publication involved. So, and that goes doubly for social media, because one of the problems that I've seen in the last 10 or so years is that people don't treat social media with the same care. You know, you put together an extensive in-depth package and it ends up in the print product, and you take enormous care to every single detail. Every millimeter or centimeter of that piece is examined and thought through and treated with care. And then somebody from the newsroom tweets something thoughtless and gets everyone in trouble. So, you know, you have to treat social media with the same care that you treat print media and the print product. And I guess that would be my closing. I hope you remember this point, is that I think that people really need to treat everything they do as a part of their publication portfolio and think about the media law implications of everything that they do.
Yeah, well, and with that, we should say thank you and also encourage people to check out the NPPA website, where you can find not only the code of ethics, but information about becoming a member, including a student member, and information about getting legal help if your nightmare scenario happens to you. Maybe Alicia or one of their other attorneys can come to your rescue and save the day. Alicia Calzada, thank you so much for making time to describe a little bit about your practice and share your knowledge. It's so valuable to have somebody who's actually worked out there on the front lines as a photojournalist, as well as an attorney for journalists for so long. That perspective is one of the things that makes the NPPA so valuable. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Frank. It's been a real pleasure spending some time with you.